The night was pitch black, as if even the moon had turned away, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. The wind swept across the fields of Kentucky, carrying a sharp, biting cold that seemed to cut straight through Sarah's jacket. Each step she took on the gravel road echoed into the darkness, a solitary sound that only heightened her unease. In her trembling hand, the beam of a flashlight wavered, its faint glow barely piercing the heavy shadows around her. The note in her pocket felt heavier than it should, its words etched into her mind as if they were a warning she couldn't escape. Save him before it's too late. There was no signature, no explanation, just that urgent plea, pulling her forward like a tether she couldn't break. Finally, she saw it. The gate stood like a forgotten skeleton of rusted metal, overgrown with creeping vines that clung to it like desperate fingers. Sarah paused, her breath clouding in the cold night air, as the whispering leaves around her seemed to grow louder, almost accusatory. There was something terribly wrong about this place, as though time itself had abandoned it. But she couldn't stop now. With a shove, she forced the gate open, its hinges screeching like a cry of protest into the empty night. Beyond it, the property stretched out in eerie silence. The air here was thick, suffocating, and carried a stench that reached her before anything else, a nauseating mix of rot, urine, and something far worse that she couldn't quite place. She followed it, her steps hesitant but determined, until she reached a decrepit barn looming ahead. Its collapsing frame seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect, threatening to crumble at any moment. Sarah hesitated at the barn door. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the night's stillness. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open, and the smell inside hit her like a physical blow. It was overpowering, a suffocating blend of decay and despair. She gagged, raising a hand to her nose as her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing fragments of a place where life had once existed but now only death seemed to linger. And then she saw it. In the farthest, darkest corner of the barn, her flashlight's beam fell on something that made her freeze in place. A horse. Or what was left of one. The creature stood motionless, its skeletal frame barely held together by skin marred with open wounds. Its black coat was caked with mud and filth, dulled to a lifeless gray. Every bone in its body was painfully visible, as though it had been carved from suffering itself. But it wasn't the state of its body that stole the air from Sarah's lungs, it was its eyes. The horse's eyes were enormous and haunting, two dark pools that seemed to hold the weight of an entire lifetime of pain. They weren't angry or frightened. They weren't hopeful or pleading. They were empty. A kind of emptiness that struck Sarah like a knife to the chest. It wasn't just a broken body in front of her, it was a broken spirit. She felt her knees give out, collapsing onto the filthy barn floor as her flashlight rolled away, casting strange, distorted shadows across the rotting wood. Her breath hitched as tears burned hot down her cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking, barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Slowly, she reached out a hand toward the horse, but stopped halfway, as if afraid her touch would hurt him even more. Her throat tightened with a raw ache, and she choked out the only words she could muster, "I'm going to get you out of here. I swear." The horse didn't flinch. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, silently enduring, as if it had long since given up on the idea that anyone could help. But Sarah couldn't look away. Something inside her snapped in that moment, a surge of anger, grief, and determination flooding through her veins. She couldn't let this be the end for him. Whatever it took, no matter the cost, she would not leave this place without him. And there, on her knees in the muck and stench of despair, Sarah made a silent vow. She would save him, no matter what it took. Sarah had always understood the quiet language of animals, their unspoken fears, their silent cries for help, and their boundless capacity for trust when treated with love. From the time she was a little girl, summers at her grandmother's ranch in Wyoming had been her sanctuary. She'd spend her mornings riding bareback through sun-drenched fields, her arms outstretched as if she could fly, with the wind rushing past her and the sound of hooves pounding the earth like a heartbeat. Her favorite horse, Midnight, a sleek black mare with a fiery spirit, was more than just a companion. She was her confidant, her escape, her joy. But all of that had been ripped away in a single, devastating night. Sarah still remembered the acrid stench of smoke that filled the air as flames engulfed the barn. The fire had spread too fast, consuming everything in its path. She had tried to run into the inferno, screaming for Midnight, but strong arms had pulled her back. The image of Midnight trapped behind the blazing doors, her eyes wide with terror, was etched into Sarah's mind, a memory that haunted her dreams. From that night on, Sarah's life changed forever. The ranch was gone, and so was Midnight. But the bond she'd felt with horses, the love, the understanding, remained. It became her driving force. She dedicated her life to rescuing animals that the world had cast aside, seeing each one as a chance to honor Midnight's memory, to save others the way she hadn't been able to save her. But even with all her years of experience, nothing had prepared her for what she found in that barn. The horse in front of her was more than neglected. He was a living ghost, a shadow of what he once must have been. His coat, once a rich, gleaming black, was now a filthy, matted mess of dirt and dried blood. His ribs jutted out sharply, a brutal reminder of his starvation, and his legs, covered in scars and sores, trembled under the weight of his frail body. Sarah's heart clenched painfully. She felt the same helplessness she had the night of the fire, but this time, she swore she would not fail. Looking around the barn, she pieced together the horrifying reality of his existence. The remnants of moldy hay lay scattered on the dirt floor, untouched for who knows how long. A shallow bowl of water, green with algae, sat forgotten in the corner. Deep grooves in the dirt showed where he had strained against the chains, desperate for freedom, until he no longer had the strength to fight. Sarah knelt before him, her voice trembling but soft. "It's okay, boy, I'm here now. You're safe." The horse flinched at the sound of her voice, his body tensing, his breathing shallow and rapid. It was clear that he expected pain, that he had learned to associate humans with cruelty. Sarah's tears blurred her vision as she carefully reached out her hand, stopping inches away from his battered face. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. "I promise." For what felt like an eternity, he didn't move. His dark, hollow eyes stayed fixed on her, unblinking, as if weighing whether she could be trusted. Finally, ever so slightly, his head lowered, and Sarah felt her breath catch. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. She set to work, her hands trembling as she tackled the chains that bound him. The rusted metal was heavy and cold, digging deep into his fragile skin. "How long have you been like this?" she murmured, her voice breaking. Each link of the chain seemed to carry the weight of his suffering, and with every tug and twist, Sarah felt his pain like it was her own. The final chain fell to the ground with a loud, metallic clang, and Sarah exhaled a shaky breath of relief. "You're free now," she said softly. But as the horse took a tentative step forward, his legs buckled, and he crumpled to the ground. Sarah lunged forward, catching his massive, trembling body as best as she could. "Easy, easy," she soothed, her arms wrapping around his neck as if she could hold him together with sheer will. His breathing was labored, his entire body shivering with exhaustion and fear. Tears streamed down her face as she rested her forehead against his, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not alone anymore. I've got you." Knowing she couldn't leave him in that barn for another second, Sarah moved quickly. She retrieved the thick blanket she'd brought, draping it gently over his skeletal frame to shield him from the night's bitter cold. Using an old rope she'd found in the barn, she fashioned a makeshift halter, speaking to him in calm, reassuring tones as she worked. "We're getting out of here, Shadow," she said, the name slipping from her lips like it had been waiting for this moment. "That's what I'll call you, Shadow. Because you survived the darkness." It took every ounce of strength she had to coax him to his feet. His steps were hesitant, each one slow and unsteady, but Sarah never let go of the rope, never stopped whispering words of encouragement. "You're doing so good, boy. Just a little further." Finally, they emerged into the open air. The moonless night was still, the cold wind biting at Sarah's face, but Shadow stopped in his tracks. His head lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring as he breathed in the crisp night air. For the first time in years, he was outside, free. Sarah watched as his eyes, still clouded with pain, seemed to flicker with something new. It wasn't quite hope, but it was the beginning of it. She reached out, gently stroking his neck, and felt him lean into her touch ever so slightly. And in that moment, under the vast, starless sky, Sarah made a silent vow: Shadow would never know suffering again. The fight to save Shadow had only just begun. When Sarah brought him back to her modest barn, it was clear that he was closer to death than she had initially feared. His body was a patchwork of deep, festering wounds, some so severe that she could see the raw tissue beneath. His legs were swollen with infection, and every movement seemed to send a ripple of pain through him. His ribs jutted out starkly, each one a cruel reminder of the starvation he'd endured. And yet, the most heartbreaking part was his stillness. He didn't resist, didn't fight. He simply stood there, like a prisoner who had accepted his sentence. Sarah's chest tightened as she prepared a makeshift bed of fresh straw in one of the stalls. She whispered soothingly as she guided him inside, her voice trembling but steady. "You're safe now, Shadow. I promise, you're safe." But nothing about the days that followed felt safe. The first night was agonizing. Shadow refused to eat, even as Sarah held fresh oats and apples under his nose. His body was so depleted that it seemed like he had forgotten how to hunger. Every few hours, she stayed by his side, coaxing him with water laced with electrolytes, her own hands trembling as she gently wiped his mouth. The barn was cold, the night air biting through her jacket, but Sarah didn't care. She sat beside him in the straw, watching his shallow breaths and praying silently, desperately, for him to survive until morning. Each day was a battle against time. She cleaned his wounds with painstaking care, even when the sight of them made her stomach churn. She massaged his legs to reduce the swelling, her fingers trembling as she worked over his broken body. Shadow would flinch at first, his instincts expecting pain, but gradually, he began to relax under her touch. As she worked, she talked to him. Her voice was soft, her words flowing like a confession, as if the barn itself was the only place she felt safe enough to bare her soul. She told him about her childhood on her grandmother's ranch, about midnight and the fire that had stolen her. She told him how she had promised herself that no other animal would suffer the way Midnight had. And as she spoke, Shadow's ears twitched slightly, as if he was listening, as if he understood. Sometimes, when she paused to rest her head on his frail shoulder, Shadow would turn his head and press his nose lightly against her arm. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight that nearly broke her. It was as if he was saying, "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." But not everyone believed Shadow deserved a second chance. One night, as Sarah was wrapping fresh bandages around his infected leg, she heard the crunch of footsteps outside the barn. Her pulse quickened, and she froze, her hand stilling over Shadow's leg. The barn door creaked open, and two figures stepped inside, the beam of a flashlight slicing through the darkness. Her heart sank when she saw them, the same men she had seen at the abandoned property. The ones who had left Shadow to rot. "That horse is ours," one of them barked, his voice cold and commanding. Sarah felt her body tense, but she didn't move from where she knelt beside Shadow. Her voice was firm, but shaking with barely contained fury. "He was dying. You left him to starve. He's not yours anymore." The taller of the two men stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "You're trespassing on private property. You stole from us. We'll call the police if you don't hand him over." Sarah's jaw clenched. She rose slowly, positioning herself between Shadow and the men, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Call them," she snapped. "And when they get here, I'll show them the photos of what you did to him. I'll show them the chains, the infections, the filth you left him in." Her voice cracked with emotion, but her resolve was steel. "Go ahead. Call them. Let's see how that goes for you." The barn was thick with tension, the kind of silence that felt like it might shatter at any moment. The two men exchanged glances, their confidence faltering. And then, Shadow did something unexpected. From behind Sarah, he raised his head, the frail but determined figure of a horse that had suffered too much but refused to be broken. His ears pinned back slightly, and he let out a low, guttural sound, not a whimper, not a cry, but something between a growl and a warning. The men froze. Shadow's presence, even in his weakened state, was enough to make them step back. "You're going to regret this," one of them muttered, before turning on his heel and walking out into the night. His companion followed close behind, the barn door slamming shut behind them. Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank to the straw beside Shadow, her hands shaking as she stroked his neck. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're gone. You're safe." But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The look in those men's eyes had been a promise, a silent threat that they weren't done with her, or with Shadow. As she leaned against him, her forehead resting against his bony shoulder, Shadow let out a long, heavy breath. It was as if he was trying to tell her the same thing she told him every day: "We'll get through this. Together." And in that moment, Sarah made another silent vow. No matter what those men tried to do, no matter how much they threatened her, she would never let Shadow go. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Sarah began to see glimpses of life returning to Shadow. At first, it was subtle, a flick of his ears when she entered the barn, a soft nicker when she approached with fresh hay. Then, one morning, she saw him eating on his own, his head dipping into the bucket of oats as if he'd finally remembered what hunger felt like. Sarah's heart swelled as she watched, her breath catching in her chest. The progress was agonizingly slow. Each small step forward came with moments of doubt and setbacks that left her questioning if he would ever truly heal. His legs were still weak, trembling with every attempt to stand for long periods. His wounds, though cleaner and beginning to close, left scars that served as permanent reminders of the hell he had endured. Despite the challenges, Sarah never gave up. She pushed him gently but persistently, encouraging him to walk just a little farther each day. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when the barn was filled with nothing but the sound of his breathing, she wondered, would he ever be the horse he was meant to be? Would he ever run free again? And then came the day Sarah decided to find out. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air felt electric with possibility. Sarah led Shadow out of the barn, her hand steady on the rope tied loosely around his neck. He followed her with slow, deliberate steps, his dark eyes watching her every move. She brought him to a wide-open field, the golden grass swaying gently in the breeze, and stopped at the center. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she untied the rope and stepped back. "You're free, Shadow," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Go on, you can do it." For a long, agonizing moment, Shadow just stood there. His body was still, his ears flicking toward the distant sound of birds. He looked at Sarah, then back at the expanse of open land before him. It was as if he wasn't sure if he could trust this freedom, this chance to be something more than the broken creature he had been. "Come on, boy," Sarah whispered, her voice full of hope and tears. "You're stronger than you think. You can do this." And then, as if her words reached some deep, unbroken part of him, Shadow took a step forward. Then another. His movements were awkward at first, his legs stiff and unsure. But with each step, something shifted. His head lifted higher, his stride grew longer, and suddenly, he began to trot. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. The trot turned into a canter, his legs moving faster and more fluidly with each stride. And then, as if a dam had finally broken, Shadow broke into a run. The sound of his hooves hitting the ground echoed across the field like a drumbeat, a rhythm that seemed to call the earth itself to attention. The wind whipped through his mane, and for the first time in years, he was free. Truly free. Sarah fell to her knees, the tears streaming down her face unstoppable. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with sobs. "You're really free." Shadow ran like he was reclaiming every moment of life that had been stolen from him. It was a miracle, unfolding right in front of her eyes. Sarah couldn't keep Shadow's transformation to herself. She recorded a short video of his first run in the field, her voice cracking with emotion as she narrated his story. She posted it online, hoping to inspire others to see the value in every life, no matter how broken. The video spread like wildfire. Within days, millions of people had seen it. Strangers from around the world left comments about how Shadow's resilience had touched their hearts, how Sarah's determination had inspired them to be better, kinder. But among the flood of messages was one that stood out. It was from a woman named Emily. "I think that's my horse," she wrote, attaching a photo of a magnificent black stallion, his coat gleaming in the sunlight. The resemblance was undeniable. Emily explained that her horse, whom she had called Onyx, had been stolen from her property 5 years earlier. She had searched for him endlessly, but eventually, the trail went cold. When she saw the video, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. Sarah invited Emily to visit, and the day she arrived was one of mixed emotions. Sarah had grown to love Shadow deeply, and the thought of letting him go was almost unbearable. But as Emily stepped out of her truck, clutching the old photo of Onyx, Sarah knew what she had to do. When Shadow saw Emily, something extraordinary happened. His head shot up, his ears perked forward, and his entire body seemed to come alive with recognition. He let out a loud, powerful whinny and trotted toward her as fast as his legs would carry him. Emily dropped the photo and fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd never see you again." Shadow nuzzled her shoulder, his movements tender and full of affection. Sarah stood back, watching the reunion with tears in her own eyes. Her heart ached, but it also swelled with pride. She had saved him, and now he was going home. Shadow now lives with Emily on a sprawling ranch, surrounded by green pastures and other horses. His coat has regained its glossy sheen, his body is strong, and his spirit is unbroken. He runs freely every day, his hooves pounding the earth with the strength and confidence of the stallion he was always meant to be. But Sarah hasn't said goodbye. She visits him often, bringing apples and soft whispers of encouragement. Each time, Shadow greets her with a gentle nuzzle, as if to say, "Thank you." This isn't just a story about saving a horse. It's a story about what can happen when someone refuses to give up, when love and compassion triumph over cruelty and despair. Sometimes, all it takes to heal a broken soul is someone who cares. And when that care is given, miracles are inevitable.